All right, so we are going to continue where we left off.
And Mr. Richard says C.
So actually, before we start talking about natural selection, we're going to talk about something different. We're going to talk about what we call artificial selection. So natural selection and artificial selection. But understanding a little bit about what artificial selection is can help us to sort of think about and understand natural selection. So artificial selection is when humans sort of intervene and make certain choices in the reproduction of other organisms that allow us to sort of mold the traits that this organism has. And humans have practiced artificial selection for tens of thousands of years by choosing which organisms they like the traits of and allowing those organisms to interbreed. We can sort of guide the pathway that those species take. This is most commonly done in agriculture and in domestication of animals. So, are there, let's say, is there such thing as a wild tomato?
There could be if you want to be.
No. Are there wild cows?
Yes.
Are there wild bananas? No.
Yes.
All of these things are not, you cannot find a natural banana like we know it, that we would buy in the store, growing out in the wild. It's not that humans found some banana plant that produces beautiful bananas and then we just started harvesting. Humans basically molded bananas and tomatoes and cows and pigs and chickens into what they are today through this process of artificial selection. Now all of those things, guys, all of those things did arise and did originate in a wild ancestor, but usually that wild ancestor is much different than what we have today. These are some examples of those things. This is what the ancestral fruit where we bred watermelons from. This little thing with huge seeds in it. This is what corn has evolved from. This tiny little thing that would give you very little nutrition. And bananas and eggplants and cabbage and kale and broccoli and carrots. Dogs evolved through artificial selection from what? Wolves. Okay, and same thing with pigs and chickens and all domestic animals, all crops have been selectively bred by humans. So how do humans do that? So how can humans mold 10,000 over the course of thousands of years these wild ancestors into what we have today as you go to the grocery store and buy? Colin?
They make animals give special ones.
Not so much make
Well,
or permit, or so if we talk about animals, we talk about dogs and wolves and so forth. Wolves are somewhat dangerous to humans and to young and to animals that humans might raise. So whenever in ancient, 100,000 years ago, what would humans do with wolves that were aggressive and dangerous? Kill them. Okay? However, if there were some wolves that happen to be slightly less aggressive, okay? Slightly more docile, you might say, what might humans do with those wolves?
Try to castigate them maybe?
Maybe, but maybe it starts with maybe they would just not kill them.
Yeah.
And if they don't kill them, what are those wolves that are slightly less aggressive? What can they do if they survive? Mate. And so,
Special hugs.
what are their chances? What are their offspring probably going to be like?
More docile.
Probably have similar traits to the parents. So they'll be slightly, maybe just a little bit more docile. And even in that litter, we're thinking about just one example of this, even in that litter, some of those wolves might be aggressive, some might be a little bit more docile. What happens to the aggressive ones? And the most tame, most docile ones are allowed to survive. And they breed together. If you imagine this process repeated hundreds of times, hundreds of generations, humans can sort of mold the evolution of wolves into what we know today, modern dogs. Same thing with these fruits. So if you take some of these ancestral watermelons, and one of them happens growing, for some genetic reason it has really smaller seeds. Well, maybe that's a version you like. So you allow that plant to keep growing, okay? And you allow it to self-pollinate and grow more of those plants, okay? And if you find in that next generation, you take again the smallest of the seeds and you allow them to grow. And again, continue raising these plants, always choosing only the one with the smallest seeds and the largest fruits, or the sweetest taste, the least bitter one. Over time, you can sort of guide the pathway that this plant takes until you have something like a modern watermelon. Even modern dog breeds. All modern dog breeds have been selectively bred by humans. You take some random generic dog, a couple groups of them, you take out of their litter of puppies the very smallest one, allow them to grow. You take from another litter the very smallest ones, put them together in an area. When they reach the proper age, they fall in love. They give each other special hugs. And they have a litter of puppies. The female has a litter of puppies. And again, maybe out of those, humans take the smallest of them. And over time, generation after generation, humans are basically reducing the size. And that's how we get really tiny dogs, or really big dogs, or dogs that are really good swimmers, dogs that are very protective. We have bred all of these types of dogs through this process of selective breeding. So all crops, all domestic animals come about through this process. Hairless cat, or a hypoallergenic cat. How did humans breed these? These are not naturally occurring. They're not wild cats with, these cats have some fur, right? It's very, very like thin and they don't shed.
These cats are.
These cats.
Oh, those things are ugly. I don't.
So how did humans do this? Humans did this. Who could sort of tell me about this process?
I know it's super.
Edis?
They would have a litter of puppies.
Puppies? That's
Puppies.
interesting.
Kittens, and they would chase the ones with the less please.
Mama's got some.
And then repeat that. So this doesn't just happen in one generation. It would take hundreds of generations. But over time, could reduce the length of the fur in these cats to these levels.
Those things are so.
Okay, again, dogs, wolves, same thing. Corn, same thing. Comes from an ancient ancestor that was bred to have large kernels, to be sweet, provide lots of nutrition, okay, over time. And so this process also happens without the selection of humans. And when it's not humans selecting which organisms survive, what do we call it? Natural selection.
Oh.
So in nature, nature decides which individuals can survive, which individuals can reproduce. And over time, it leads to changes in the species, just like artificial selection led to changes in the species.
So that's how some of them would remain the same,
Yes.
because only
Only
a certain few.
subsets are. So the question becomes here, we'll talk a little bit, how do we know species have changed? As we said yesterday, for most of history, people thought that species don't change, that they are fixed, that they've always been the way we see them today, and they always will be that way forevermore. Well, how do we know that species can change? Well, one of the best types of evidence we have is through fossils. Fossils are the remains of preserved tracks, the preserved bones, the preserved remnants of plants and animals and bacteria that lived long ago. And so we can look at the fossil record and we can see lots of different things. So the fossil record shows us that there is a type of horse-like ancestor that lived millions of years ago. But these horses were the size of a dog. And they had toes. They didn't have hooves. They had regular toes like a dog would. And we have examples of fossils of these horse-like creatures 6 million years ago, 5 million years ago. And what we see is that they changed over time until we get to what we call modern horses today. So fossils can tell us about this. Fossils tell us there are organisms that exist, like a trilobite, that don't exist on Earth anymore. They're extinct now. And so species are not fixed. The species that are here today were not always the species that have always been here. Dinosaurs are a great example of that. Okay? We know we have fossils of huge reptiles. They don't exist anywhere on Earth anymore. They've become extinct. All right, so another way we have of knowing species change and evolve and how they're related is by looking at their structures, their anatomy. So this illustration shows the bones within the arm of a human, the leg of a cat, the flipper of a whale, and the wing of a bat. Now, if at first you think about these organisms, a bat that flies through the air, a whale that swims through the sea, a cat that runs around on 4 legs, or a human that walks and has arms. You may say, well, these are all very different organisms. One flies, one swims, one walks on all 4s. They must be distantly related. Hello? Yep. Okay. Thanks. So when we actually look inside of the skin and muscle and fat of these organisms, here's what we see. The basic bone structure is the same. All of these species have one upper arm bone, humerus. All of these species have 2 forearm bones. Okay? See them here. All of these species have wrist bones and finger bones. Now the sizes, the shapes have altered somewhat over time. Some bones are longer, some are shorter. Some are fused together, some are not. The skin around those bones has changed. The musculature has changed and so forth. But basically it's the same bone structure in all of those species. What do you think that tells us about these 4 species? Picture? They're related. They are related. These are all what? Mammals. And all mammals have a common ancestor at some point in our evolutionary past. And these structures help us to understand that. Is a whale more closely related to a shark or a human?
Sure.
Here are 2. Who's confident in their answer and wants to explain why? Ella, what do you think?
It would be closer to humans because they're still mammals even if they live in the water.
Yeah, if you were to look inside of a whale, of a shark fin, would you find bones? No, you wouldn't find these same bones that match with a human. So you're correct. Whales are more closely related to the other mammals than they are to fish. Alan?
Just looking at like the little picture in that one, I noticed that like they're each like animal has like different like adaptations and different like things that helped it and it's like where it lives and its habitat. Like the bat's got really thin and
Yeah.
fairly small arms so it can fly. So it's like more aerodynamic. The whales they like have big fins, so they can like push through the water. The cats like low down and bend so you can
Yeah, if
swing
you
off as well.
look at these, the differences between them also tell us about evolution. In that the differences come about because they have adapted to different conditions. Some adapted to life in the water, some adapted to life on land, others adapted to flying through the air. So both the similarities and the differences can be instructive in how these species have evolved.
Can you cat flights with you, man?
You can tell it.
You say you're still today? You gotta come back that last minute?
Last minute, last show.
219, 220.
Oh wait, I have study hall.
Oh.
Sorry. Have a great day, Mr. Arcuri.
I always
It's good
do.
to see you again.
You too, scientists. Enjoy the rest of your class.
You didn't close the door.
I'll close the door, that was my good
All right, this is all these vegetables, right, that you may or may not like, all evolved from mustard plant. All right, yes, mustard is a plant. So we also can tell how species evolved through their distribution, where they are located. Okay, similar organisms tend to live in a similar vicinity. Often we see that organisms live on islands, have adapted to have unique traits and adaptations because they've been isolated from other species without interbreeding. DNA evidence. Oh, these are Galapagos tortoises. Okay, and they live on these various islands in the Galapagos, so off the coast of South America. And what you see is that the shape of their shell has become distinct, and different tortoise. You can tell which island the tortoise came from based on the shape of its shell. DNA is an important means of evidence as well. We can nowadays easily compare the DNA of two species. And what do you think it means if it's similar? They're closely related. Just like, who is your DNA most similar to? Be specific. No, not your parents.
Siblings.
Your
Yeah,
siblings.
brothers.
Okay? You and your siblings share the most DNA in common. What if you were to compare you and your brother's DNA to you and your first cousins? Which are you going to be closer to? Your brother. And your first cousin will be slightly different. How about your second cousin? Yes. So, who's the common ancestor of you and your sister? Your parents. You only have to go back one generation. Who's the common ancestor of you and your first cousin? Which would be your grandparents, right? You and your first cousins, you have the same grandparents. How about your second cousins? 3 generations. So the more similar the DNA is of two individuals, the closer they had a common ancestor. We can also see that when we look inside of organisms, there oftentimes are kind of evolutionary leftovers. We call them vestigial structures. If you look inside of a whale, it has these weird tiny little bones that are just kind of sitting there attached to nothing. They have no purpose. They're not connected to any musculature. They're not connected to the tail or the flippers or anything. You know why they might be there? Ali?
The ancestors that it had more bones than that, so over time, less bones are going to appear.
Yeah, whales actually evolved from, anyone know what they evolved from? No? They're mammals, so they arose from mammals. They arose from sort of, kind of like wolf-like mammals that eventually adapted to life in the water, and it was beneficial for them to have smaller and smaller hind limbs until after millions of years they have no hind limbs. Allows them to move through the water easier. It was an advantage for them to have smaller and smaller hind limbs, but they still have those bones in there. So they're kind of the leftovers that tell us a little bit about their evolutionary history. Snakes have tiny little hip bones, okay, in their body, even though they have no legs. Because snakes also evolved from four-legged lizards.
Right.
All right, so how does this actually happen? Through the process of natural selection. Natural selection is the concept that Darwin and Wallace came up with that explains how species change over time in natural situations. So it's really not very complicated. Easy to understand. Basically, it says that any living things that are well adapted to their environment are going to survive and reproduce. Any organism that is born that is not well adapted is not going to survive. It's not going to reproduce. So, how does it actually happen? Well, first things first. We call this sometimes survival of the fittest. That's another sort of phrase for natural selection. So the individuals that are best suited, best adapted to their environment are able to survive and reproduce, passing on these beneficial traits to the next generation. Any individuals not well adapted will die off before they reproduce. And so over time, any trait that an organism is born with that is helpful becomes more and more common. And that leads to the species changing over time. And evolution is why we have such a huge diversity of living organisms on the earth today. Because species have evolved over time. Species split into separate species. And because the earth is so old, there's been plenty of time for a wide variety of living organisms to evolve. So the first thing you have to start with is variation. What does that word mean? I say there's a lot of variation in shirt color in this classroom today. Jake, what's it mean?
So kind of like similar?
Not sort of the opposite, actually. Like variation means differences. In nature, each individual that's born is unique. Now, do we in this classroom, we're all one species, but do we vary from each other? Yeah, we vary, and it's obvious to us. We vary in all sorts of aspects. Do squirrels have variations between them?
Yeah, some are black, some are like gray,
Yeah.
some are brown.
Now, we are not as attuned to that, right? We might see a squirrel in our backyard, a gray squirrel, and say, yeah, they're all the same. But really, they're not all the same. They have just as much variation between them as we do, but because we all belong to the same species, we are noticing very easily. So to squirrels, we probably all look exactly the same. But to them, they all look different. They can recognize each other. So there is natural variation that arises in all populations. Here we have some variation in the pattern on some ladybugs. Here we have some variation in fur color in some grizzly bears. So there's natural variation. And in nature there's also competition. What is there competition for in nature? Tyler?
Food.
To get food, that's an obvious one. How about some other means of competition within nature? Abby?
Some species will fight over mates.
For mates, yep. Anything else, Tyler?
Shelter.
Shelter, living space, homes,
Water.
water. Is there ever competition to avoid something? What is there competition to avoid? Ella?
Like predators.
Predators. Okay, that's a form of competition as well. So competition is sometimes called the struggle for survival. There are limited resources in an ecosystem. Can every fish egg that is laid in a stream survive and grow into an adult fish? No. Fish can lay hundreds of thousands of eggs at one time. They cannot possibly all survive into adulthood. There's a limit to that. So which ones survive? Which ones do make it to adulthood? The what? Maybe? Elizabeth? I think I do behind my desk there. So the ones that survive are the ones that happen to be born with the most beneficial traits. Okay. Behind the screen, maybe? So we call those the best adapted individuals. They are the ones that can survive into adulthood. The ones that can get enough food. The ones that can avoid predators. Those are the ones that survive due to the characteristics they happen to be born with. So what decides which ones die and which ones survive and which ones reproduce? Nature. That's why I call it natural selection. Nature is choosing which organisms can survive and which cannot. So there's this competition for survival. Let's finish up these next two and then I'll answer questions. So over time, we know that if an individual can survive and grow into adulthood, it can also then reproduce. And when it reproduces, what are the offspring going to be like? Similar to the parents. And so if they had a trait that was helpful, that allows them to survive, chances are they might pass that trait on to the next generation. Okay. And over time, that happens generation after generation until these adaptations arrive. So being born with darker skin color for a frog was beneficial. It'll survive longer. It'll reproduce. Might pass on that same coloration to its offspring. They'll survive and reproduce, have more young. What will happen to the frogs that don't have that trait? They'll be less likely to survive, less likely to reproduce. And over many generations, all frogs, eventually in that population, will have that helpful characteristic. We call those helpful characteristics adaptations. Over time, these sorts of changes can result in new species. Did you have a question?
Yeah. Going back to like who do we have most like similar DNA with, and we said like our brothers and our sisters.
Yep.
Being a boy, do I have like closer DNA to my brother, or is it just the same just because like?
No, well, slightly more to your brother than your sister, yeah. Because you inherited a Y chromosome from your father, and so did your brother.
That's pretty
Your
deep.
sister inherited an X chromosome from your father. All right. So, notice when we say survival of the fittest, what does fit mean? We don't mean like, like me, not like physically fit, but fit in a different way.
You're right. You're not.
What does fittest mean? John?
Like having the traits that most fit inherit.
Yes, having the best traits. Now that depends on the situation. Is it survival of the strongest?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Is it survival of the smallest?
Sometimes.
Survival of the fastest?
Sometimes.
The most hidden? All right, you get the point. It depends on the situation. Sometimes it's beneficial to be strong and large. Other times, depending on the ecosystem, the situation, it might be more beneficial to be small and hidden. Okay? It might be more beneficial to stand out in your coloration, or it might be more beneficial to blend in. It all depends on the exact situation. So that's why we say it's survival of the fittest. So if we look here, this little drawing, what variations do you see? in the population of insects? Is here? One obvious one is the color. Any other variations you see? Ollie?
Size.
The size, yes. Any others? Diksha? Their eye colors are different. Yes.
That one.
So those are all examples of variations. What do you think they're competing for here? Maybe.
Or not getting hit by the gecko.
Yes. Most likely to avoid being eaten by a gecko.
It was a gecko.
Yes. So which ones do you think are going to survive?
Small green ones.
The small green ones, probably. The ones that blend in the best. So what's going to happen over time? What's going to happen to the large brown ones? Probably the first to be eaten. Are they going to pass on their brown color to the next generation? Not likely. Which ones are more likely to pass on their genes?
The small green ones.
The smaller green ones. Now let me ask you this. What if they were all identical? If they were all this exact same color and size, would the species evolve?
The big ones will die out.
No, if they're identical.
all
They're
the
all
exact
this size,
same.
all this
Exact
color, all this shape, they're all identical insects. There would be no natural selection because none of them would have any better or worse traits. They just are all identical. So in order for natural selection to happen, you must have variation to begin with. Abby?
And I think in this video they said something about genetic mutations or whatever.
Yes.
So that could possibly lead to a slower course of evolution.
Faster. So we'll talk more about where these variations come from, and mutations are a part of that. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Oh. Yeah, we gotta finish all that tomorrow. What? Skipping school, Tyler?
I colored pencil.
If I run into your dad at Hannaford again, I'm gonna have to have a conversation with him.
I'm going skiing.
You're going skiing?
I mean, no.
He's skipping.
You're feeling sick?
He's very ill tomorrow, but not right now. Don't ask me how I can predict that.